John chapter 5, verse 1. Now, I want to kind of review for a second where we are. I call this first section of John chapter 5 Christ's power over human hopelessness. But it begins a new section in John's development in his gospel. From John chapter 1 through the end of John chapter 4, we have what Mr. Tenney says in that book I asked you to get, to read about it, John, the Gospel of Belief. I believe he summarized it very well. The first section, as he said, is the period of consideration. And so during that period, Jesus was being presented, and he was, through the various witnesses to him and through his works and things, he was presenting himself to Israel as to who he is. And everyone was considering. There was no hostility at the time. Everybody was considering and evaluating what he said, what he did, and so forth. And it's like, I believe, Nicodemus summarized in John chapter 3. He was the teacher of Israel. He was the greatest teacher in Israel. And he came to Jesus by night, and he said, Master, we know that you must be a teacher who's come from God, for no one can do the miracles that you're doing unless God is with him. So he came to the correct decision as everyone considered Jesus. But he hadn't taken a further step. But now that we come to John chapter 5, and John chapter 5 and chapter 6 will be the period of controversy, the reaction to Jesus' words, to his teachings, and to his claims are now going to heat up. This is the section where Jesus really throws his gauntlet into the arena. And of course, leading the controversy against him are all the religious leaders, virtually all of them. And they stir up the people to be in indecision. But Jesus' purpose in this new period is to force people to evaluate what he's saying, to evaluate what he is doing, and to come to a personal decision about those facts, about him personally. And Jesus will always do this. And even in our life, we go through a period where we hear about him, and there's a period of consideration and so forth. But Jesus will do something to force you to come to a decision about him personally. And that's what he does in this section. As a matter of fact, it's very exciting as you look at the things he presses here, because he's going to force people to decide whether he is a deceiver sent from hell, or whether he is a psychotic who is an egomaniac and has deceived himself into thinking that he's God, or he's going to bring them to see that he must be who he claims to be. God manifest in the flesh, the promised Messiah, the Son of God. Now those are the only three possibilities that Jesus leaves to anyone because of what he said, what he did, and what he claimed. If people try to wiggle out of a real decision about Jesus, as most, by the way, of the so-called pastors of the church today try to do, to say, well, Jesus was a great teacher. He was a great prophet. But he wasn't the Son of God. He wasn't God. And you hear that all the time. And, of course, before every Easter and before every Christmas, the wackos come out of the woodwork They call themselves, what is it, the Jesus Seminar? Yeah, the Jesus Seminar, and you'll see them featured in the Godless Time magazine, the Godless Newsweek magazine, Godless everything else, and give them plenty of space. And they'll come out with their new theories about why Jesus never claimed to be God, and why we can't believe the Scripture. It was dreamed up by people hundreds of years later, and so forth. I always wonder how they can come up with that, since you try to find another book like the Bible that creates a character like Jesus Christ, you can't find one. There's nothing like it. So what we have to conclude is that a bunch of nondescript people hundreds of years later sit down and synthesize something that was nebulous and came up with the greatest character that's ever been put in literature. Of course, they don't think that way. They don't think critically. But you see, Jesus didn't leave that You can't just say, well, I like Jesus. He was really a great man, a great religious teacher. He didn't leave that. Listen, if he's not who he claimed to be, then he's the devil out of hell. He is a psychotic, crazy, and you shouldn't listen to him. But the only hang-up is Jesus did the sort of things and said the sort of things that won't let an intellectually honest person easily shove him into those categories. But you can't just kind of put on a gray suit and a gray hat and charge down the middle either, because you can't be neutral. Jesus didn't leave that option to us. Yeah, he has to be one of those two, or he has to be who he claimed to be, because he claimed to be God who stepped out of eternity into time and took upon himself a true human nature without ceasing to be God. And those two natures, God and man, were inseparably united forever. So, in chapters 5 and 6, the heat is turned up, because he begins to make claims that no one can make unless he truly is God. All right, let's look now at some of the things that he does here. Look at verse 1. It says, after these things. Now, this is a nondescript period of time after what Jesus did in chapter 4. There's just a nondescript leap forward in the life of Jesus. John's purpose was not to make a chronological history. It is chronological, but there's spaces deliberately left because he's picking things out of the true life of Jesus to develop a case to prove that he is the Son of God. So when it says, after these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Most likely, this was the Passover, because that was a feast that every godly Jew had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate. So Jesus not only kept up with the requirements of Judaism, but he loved to do the things that the Bible said that they should do. So he goes up to Jerusalem. Now, I want you to notice something else, and this is not customary with Jesus. Usually, we saw in chapters 1 through 4, Jesus goes with his disciples to places, doesn't he? Or didn't he? But now he doesn't. He goes alone. He goes alone to Jerusalem, and he goes, it says in verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticoes. All right, he seeks out, he goes by himself, he seeks out a very specific place. Now, those who have been with me to Israel, we always go over there. We know where the thing is today. It's, the city's been destroyed so many times and ruins poured over, and then they build on top of that, that the Pool of Bethesda is way down below the level of the ruins today. But you can still see it, and you can see some of the columns that was part of that pool. And it's very interesting. You remember, John, more than any other gospel writer, keeps up with, he uses numbers that have symbolic meaning. The Bible has very definite symbolic meaning numbers, and he uses that frequently. We saw the 2 days last time, didn't we? All right, this time he talks about this being the Pool of Bethesda with 5 porticoes. What does the number 5 stand for in the Bible? It's consistently used with a concept. Grace. 5 is the number of grace, and it's aptly used here as a symbol. So he goes to the Pool of Bethesda. In Hebrew, the Pool of Bethesda means the pool of mercy. And so he goes to the Pool of Bethesda where there are 5 porticoes. Now, what are porticoes? What existed there was, they had arches and 5 beautiful columns that supported those arches, and in between those areas were 5 porches. And then it gets to be something that tugs at your heart, because in verse 3 it says, and in these 5 porches